It's great to see you this morning here in TANGRAM. And so on behalf of CMA-CGM and TANGRAM, I would like to extend my appreciation for our ongoing partnership with the Paris School of Economics and the work which is carried out by the Globalization Chair. We know that we are living fascinating times, so I think it's more interesting than ever to have this time of exchange this morning. This collaboration between the industry and academia is extremely important. It enables us to gain a deeper and more nuanced understanding of the forces shaping both our sector and the broader global economy. When we reflect on CMA-CGM development, it becomes evident that our journey is extremely tied to the larger story of globalization. I think probably CMA-CGM is a kind of a symbol of globalization in itself. From the outset, Jacques Saadé, the founder of this company, which is now led by Rodolphe Saadé, his son, foresaw the pivotal role that container shipping would play in international trade and recognized the transformative impact of China's rise as a global manufacturing powerhouse. And over the years, these trends have not only materialized, but they also became defining features of the global economic landscape. Today, maritime transport supports approximately 70% of the value of international trade, with container shipping accounting for nearly 2/3 of that. Since the early 90s, the proportion of global GDP represented by trade in goods has risen from less than a quarter to over 42%. And the value of exported goods has increased fivefold over the same period. These profound shifts have reshaped supply chains, business models, and economic development across the globe. China's role in this transformation is particularly striking. In 1990, China accounted for less than 5% of global industrial production. Today, it contributes nearly a third. This kind of seismic shift has not only redefined where goods are manufactured, but has also revolutionized the functioning of global supply chains. And of course, globalization is far from a straightforward process. We can see this every day. It is shaped by a complex interplay of factors, including transport and logistic networks, labor costs, industrial and trade policies, and financial systems, among others. For companies like ours, understanding these dynamics and anticipating how they might evolve is obviously critical to making informed decisions and maintaining a competitive edge. This is precisely why our collaboration with the Paris School of Economics is so important. The research generated by the Globalization Chair provides us with valuable insights into the evolution of supply chains, the transformative potential of new technologies, and the implications of policy changes on global trade. And so I encourage all of us to explore the Chair research findings, which are readily available on their website. Looking to the future, we know that the global landscape will continue to evolve. We will face challenges, geopolitical shifts, rapid technological advancements, and the growing imperative of sustainability. Yet, alongside these challenges lie opportunities to innovate and enhance the way we operate. So at CMA-CGM, we are committed to adapting to these changes and to collaborating with partners like PSE to better understand and navigate the dynamics of global trade. Thanks for your attention. Thanks for participating to this conference. I look forward to the discussions of today, to fresh ideas that will emerge from today, and I'm happy to leave the floor to Sandra Poncet from PSE. Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you. So good morning. Thank you, Ramon, for this nice introduction. It's also my pleasure to gather today for the second edition of the annual conference of the Globalization Chair. So the chair is a research chair that was launched early 2003 at the Paris School of Economics with the sponsorship of CMA, CGM, and TANGRAM. And the ambition was to analyze and understand what already appeared, well, it's not exactly new, but what appeared as a new deal of globalization after 30 years of hyper-globalization. The intuition was that there was a reconfiguration on the way, and our objective was to understand the various causal forces at work and describe the implications for all actors, including companies, workers, territories, and states. And so this is especially important today, and even more today than before. And so the chair has actively supported the production and dissemination of research, both theoretical and empirical research on these topics of this reconfiguration of globalization. We've organized various workshops, up to 20 in the last 2.5 years. Everything is indeed listed on the website. We've explored topics as diverse as industrial policies, the impact of sanctions, the challenges of energy transition, the importance of greening the economy, the role of consumer preferences, maritime economics. In the fall, we have 3 workshops that are already planned. The first one is going to be on green R&D and industrial policy in September, then maritime economics, and the last one in December that is just announced, which is on artificial intelligence. So we really try to have a diversity of topics and diversity of approach. And for this, we welcome, and we have welcomed dozens of leading researchers to discuss and interact. And what we're really proud of is we also supported a new generation of doctoral and postdoctoral students through the dissemination of knowledge with the summer school and financing of fellowships. And so some of the beneficiaries of those fellowships for a postdoc and doctoral fellowships are in the room, and I'm very happy with this. On the website, you'll also see the policy briefs. So we have up to 16 policy briefs that are supposed to inform the public debate on those various topics. Today's conference also reflects on this diversity of approaches, angles that are diverse but complementary to try to understand what is going on with the reconfiguration of international linkages. We adopted the same format as last year's conference with 2 keynotes and 2 roundtables. And I think it's very important to optimize and magnify the interactions between research and decision-making, to have the capacity to have interactions with the floor, and on the roundtables to have connections with academia and professionals. So we'll start today with a keynote on an historical perspective given by Kevin O'Rourke. I'll elaborate a little bit on this talk, but it's really about understanding possibly how lessons that we got in the past maybe have been forgotten. Then we'll switch to a sectoral focus. Last year, we had 2 sectoral focus on roundtables on automobile and apparel. This year, we'll speak about agri-food, which is also very important for France. We have clearly a comparative advantage in this, but it's also a key sector for food security, sustainability concerns. And we'll also discuss the role of the reconfiguration and competition across corporate actors for that sector and the importance it has for consumers. This afternoon, we'll have again a keynote, and we are very glad to have Mirto Kalupsidi, who will speak about transport, investment in infrastructure and disruptions applied to the maritime economy. And then the last roundtable is going to be moderated by Simon Rey, and hopefully will be a bit forward-looking in a sense that it will reflect on the trends in the international organization of the supply chains. We really chose the roundtable format because we think it's a good format to bring together, again, leading researchers and practitioners, and to promote the creation of a genuine bridge between research and decision making. We hope the flow of ideas to be both ways, right, from the academia to the professionals and the other way around. And clearly what I wanted to say is that this collaboration and this exchange is not without frictions, as trade of goods is. Just for the anecdote, researchers are clearly used to their specific jargons, their specific technical tools, softwares. And one of the frictions was really related to this impressive screen that uses, so it's an ultra-modern 32:9 screen. And it's true that the slides and the software that we used are not corresponding to this. And I really must say that I was very impressed with let's say, the professionalism, the composure also, and the adaptability of TANGRAM and CMA-CGM teams that really accompany the researchers to adjust. And it went both ways. Huh? I think there was a two-way learning process. Another source of adjustment relates to the stress we had in the organization related to the recent fires and the prospects that eventually we could not all come. Clearly, researchers are used to this long-term mode where we are not so much in the emergency mode. But clearly, I must say that I was really struck by the exemplary response of the team here that have really been able to stay calm, be resilient. And what you have today, because of course there had been some adjustments. So 3 of the speakers will join on Zoom because they could not come. And clearly everything will for sure run smoothly. And this is largely thanks to the dedication and hard work and professionalism of the team here. So I really want to warmly thank the work of Cécile. Some of you had exchanged numerous emails from PSC, but also Capucine, Céline, the IT group. I mean, here it has, we are really in good hands. And I really want to say that it's a great pleasure for me to to make the trip and see how events like this can be professionally organized. I also want to thank the moderators of the roundtables. I really gave them the autonomy to organize their roundtables the way they wanted. And so Charlotte Emelinger from CEPI will deal with the agri-food roundtable, and Simon Ray of CMA-CGM on the one on disruptions or perspective this afternoon. I really extend you my greatest thanks. Okay, now I can introduce the first keynote. And so I'm very happy to have such a distinguished economic historian on the stage. So Kevin O'Rourke will show you what he has gathered of all his research on economics history and international economics. He recently joined Sciences Po in 2024 as research director of CNRS. But after a long career of prestigious academic positions that he held, starting with Columbia University, pursuing with Harvard University, University College of Dublin, Trinity College, University of Oxford, and NUIB, New York University, Abu Dhabi, sorry. He's really internationally recognized for an impressive set of publications, books, more than 100 research articles on the related topics of economic history and globalization. And today, as I already alluded to, he will review a journey that has been done by many countries on how to treat partners. So a lesson was learned, and it seems that this lesson somehow starts to be forgotten. And so the floor is yours, Kevin. And I didn't do a joke on his middle name, but I'll do that maybe for the conclusion. Maybe on the... yeah, perfect.
Thanks very much. And thanks for the invitation. It's lovely to be in Marseille for my very first time. So April the 2nd, 2025 was the end of an era that goes back, 80 years at least. You could say that it went back 100 years if you took a purely domestic American perspective. So I thought it'd be helpful to think a little bit about the origins of this world that we all grew up in and that Donald Trump sort of casually and brutally destroyed in a way that people haven't maybe completely recognized. I'm going to start my story in 1941. America's not yet at war, but it soon will be. And Roosevelt and Churchill meet on a ship off of the coast of Newfoundland, and they sign an 8-point plan for how they hope the world will look after the Allied powers have eventually defeated the Nazis. Most of it is standard Wilsonian stuff. So, you cannot invade other people's territory to try to seize it by force, for example, something else that seems to be going out of the window nowadays, sadly, and not just it's not just the Russians either who are at it. If you listen to Mr. Trump, but what I want to focus on is one of the two economic clauses. So they say, you can read it for yourselves. They will endeavor to ensure that all states, great or small, victor or vanquished, because they were going to be nice to the Germans after World War II in a way that they hadn't been after World War I. That was a lesson that they'd learned. Of access on equal terms is what I've bolded, of equal terms to the trade and to the raw materials of the world that they need. Okay, so there was the notion of equality of access to trade in that statement. And this eventually is going to morph into Article 1 of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the generalized most favored nation status of all members of the WTO nowadays. So with respect to customs duties, tariffs, and various other things, any advantage, any tariff cut that you grant to any other contracting party on any product will be immediately and unconditionally extended to all other members of the WTO. In other words, you can't discriminate. If you have a tariff cut for one country, you have to have a tariff cut for everybody. And of course, that's exactly what Donald Trump tore up and threw in the bin on April 2nd. Most of the commentary was about how high these tariffs are. But I think a much more dangerous feature of what he did is he just threw away the central rule that has governed the way that we've done trade since World War II, which is that we don't discriminate, with a few well-known exceptions. You can discriminate if you have a customs union, you can discriminate if you have a free trade area, but apart from that, you just don't discriminate. And as we know, that's not where he's going now. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about where the MFN principle comes from and how America came to adopt it. And then I want to argue that America had very good reasons for adopting it, actually, in the 1930s and 40s. The hard economic interests were at stake because they found themselves discriminated against in important markets. And they also had geopolitical reasons for promoting non-discrimination in trade. So that's my agenda. And the story begins in Marseille, actually. So several writers have found what they call the embryo of the MFN principle in a treaty signed by the city of Marseille and Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, in which Frederick granted to Marseille the same privileges that he had previously granted to Genoa and Pisa. So Marseille was not necessarily the most favored nation of Frederick, but it was at least as well favored as Genoa and Pisa. But really this clause emerges as a standard feature of international treaties in the 17th century and the 18th centuries. This is the period of mercantilist expansion. The great trading nations of Europe, the Dutch, the British, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, are all going overseas. They're trading, they're setting up colonies, they're fighting a lot with each other about trade, among other things. But they are therefore also doing treaties, with each other. And so it becomes kind of administratively convenient to, rather than say, we'll give you this, 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 and this, and this that we'd previously given other people, just to say, look, we will give you whatever we had given other people. And then a more important point is that it wasn't just retrospective, it was prospective, because if we say, we're saying we won't just give you what we gave them in the past, but anything we give to them in the future, we'll give to you as well. So that's the crucial function of the MFN clause. If you don't have it, then I could do a deal with you, and I give you stuff and you give me stuff in return. But then next year you turn around and you do an even better deal with somebody else, and I find myself at a disadvantage in your market. And then what good was the deal I did to you, and why did I make those concessions? And so I might not do a deal with you at all. You know, and so that's really why this MFN clause is so important when it comes to tariff cutting. So it goes back a long way. There's a gradual evolution of the thing. The Anglo-Ottoman Treaty of 1675 said, you know, that we will give you whatever we gave whatsoever other Christian nation, which I suppose gave the Ottomans the option of doing better deals with people to the east of them and so on. The honor of inventing the most favored nation phrase goes to the Danes, I'm happy to say, and also the Hansa. So I don't know if a shipping company feels a certain brother feeling with the Hansa, but they were the ones who got there first. All right, but very often when we tell the story of non-discrimination, we actually come back to France and to the Covenant-Chevalier Treaty of 1860 between France and Britain. I haven't got a picture of Monsieur Chevalier. I do have a picture of Cobden, who was one of the great apostles. He was one of these great liberal peace theorists. He believed that trade and peace go hand in hand. Okay, so for him, this was about more amicable relations with the French as much as it was about economics. They do a treaty, which I'll talk about, and in the succeeding decade or two, there's a whole network of these treaties spanning Europe. There's a real spaghetti bowl of treaties, and there's a very rapid reduction in tariffs across the continent until things change. Now, what does this treaty involve? So the British say to the French, "You are our most favored nation," and the French say to the British, "You are our most favored nation." Now, we can maybe debate which of those two statements is on the face of it more implausible, but it has a technical meaning, and the meaning is as follows. Now, introduce a third country, Prussia. And France is going to do some sort of a deal with Prussia. It's going to give the Germans some concession alpha in return for some other concession beta. Because the UK is France's most favored nation, that means it's not less favored than Prussia, which means that the French are obliged to give alpha to the British for free. That's what the most favored nation clause means. Now, the Americans from the start took a different view. So their very first trade treaty is with France, again in 1778. And what they agree is that if, you know, you do a deal and you make a concession to another country, then you've got to give the same concession to, you know, France or America, depending on who we're talking about. You've got to make the concession freely if the concession that you made to the Brits was freely given. And you've got to make the same concession to France in return for the same compensation that you got from the Brits if the Brits had given you something in return for it. All right, so you have a right to demand the same concession that your partner gives to other countries, but you can only demand that if you're willing to give them back what they've given the other country. So in pictures, this is how it looks like. They're each other's conditional most favored nations. All right, now there's some sort of a deal with Prussia. The Americans give Prussia, whatever that Greek letter is, Xi, is it? In return for delta, no, what is it? What is it, Thierry? C. Yeah, there you are. Theorists are useful at times to have in an audience. So they, C, in return for delta. All right, so does the United States have to give France C? And the answer is only if France gives them back delta. So that's the American interpretation. That's the American version of this most favored nation clause. Now, why? And the argument was fairness. You know, we've, you know, given, you know, we got something, we gave the Prussians something and they gave us something back. And so why should the French free ride? It just doesn't seem fair. You know, they just get it for free. The answer to that is that, well, under the unconditional system, the Americans will get something, right? Because anytime the French do a deal with the Brits or whoever, the Americans will get those concessions for free, you know? Now, it's true that if you're a very suspicious fellow, you might say, well, the French, maybe they're just gonna not make concessions to anybody else, you know? They're just gonna free ride. They're just gonna let other people make concessions amongst themselves, get those concessions then generalized to them for free, and then, you know, the Americans won't get anything out of it. But at least, you know, if you have the unconditional version of the MFN relationship with the French, you know that you'll never be undercut in their market. And of course, that's not what, you know, the Americans could be guaranteed under this conditional system. And it turned out that basically signing a conditional most favored nation clause treaty with the Americans was of little use to you, because they basically, you know, they were the judges of what was the equivalent compensation, you know, and of course they never concluded that the compensation that you were offering was equivalent. You know, that's just obvious, you know. So as Weiner says, you know, any concessions that they did make to his treaty partners by virtue of these clauses, they were unintentional, or the consequences of inadvertence, you know, and you typically had to go to court to get what you wanted. So it was pretty useless, this conditional thing, from the point of view of America's trading partners. And it got worse because the Americans, they were quite cunning. You know, they thought they could use this to their advantage. So now they have this deal with the French, and the French do a deal with Prussia. All right, and then the point is there's other countries in the network as well. So Britain is in the network as well, and Britain and France have an unconditional most favored nation relationship with each other. So what does that mean? That means that under the terms of that treaty, the French have got to give alpha to Britain because they had given it to Prussia, yes? And in return for what? And the answer is in return for nothing, because it's an unconditional clause, right? And so you can see what the Americans are hoping now. They then can say, aha, you gave the Brits alpha in return for nothing. And so therefore we should get alpha in return for nothing. So that's pretty clever. Except that it's so clever that it's not clever at all, because what happens is that people just get very angry with the Americans. They denounce their treaties with them, and the Americans end up finding themselves being discriminated against, basically in all European markets. You know, so you can be too clever sometimes for your own good. Yeah, the only concessions they got, writes Weiner, was either concessions that removed discriminations that they wouldn't have been facing if they'd just been a normal trading country. And then there were two concessions that they got from the Brazilians, which I'm going to have to look into, that they got through strong arm tactics, and a couple of presidents later had to apologize for that. You can see that none of this is going to be good for international harmony or for America's relationships with the rest of the world. And so in 1923, they basically break with this tradition, and they adopt the unconditional MFN clause in subsequent treaties. However, it is still protectionist, as we know, because we know what's going to happen in 1929 and 1930. And so I want to talk a little bit about then the lessons that they learned from the protectionism of the interwar period. So it starts with Messrs. Hawley and Smoot over here and their famous tariff. Now, it's not the highest tariff increase of the interwar period. I mean, the Ford-Macomber tariff in 1922 actually led to a bigger percentage point increase in protection, but Smoot-Hawley happening as it did at the onset of the Great Depression, when everybody needs more markets, nobody can sell their stuff, it's going to be very badly received by America's trading partners. It has its origins in agricultural distress, but then there's this process of log rolling, as they call it, where, you know, the congressmen vote for each other's favorite tariffs. If you give me what, you know, I want, then I'll give you what you want. And so it ends up encompassing a lot of industrial tariffs also. And yet the average tariff is raised by roughly 6 percentage points. And other countries were furious, is the point. Other countries are absolutely furious. Even before the tariff goes through, there's 30 effectively countries, including Canada, who have officially protested to the United States in anticipation of what's going to happen. Because, of course, they can see the legislative process at work, so they know what's going to happen well in advance of the bill being finally passed. And several countries raised tariffs of particular interest to American exports, either shortly after or even before the Hawley-Smoot tariff is increased. And there are some familiar features, maybe. There are things that might resonate with us today. So high-tech exports. you know, you might think would be a good target for America, for Europe, if we really get involved in a trade war with them, service exports and so on. Well, high-tech exports were targeted then. Cars was a particular target. Sometimes tariffs were explicitly raised on American exports, so it was overt discrimination. And then sometimes, you know, the big brains up in Paris, they figured out more subtle ways of achieving the same end. So they increased their tariffs on cars. They changed the tariff on cars from a value basis to a weight basis. American cars being bigger, they were particularly badly affected. And yeah, you can see there the quote, they basically shut the French market to medium-priced American cars. You know, the Italians do cars as well. Lots of people do cars. There's also consumer boycotts in lots of countries, which again we're seeing today. I mean, I'm half Danish, and that's quite a big thing in Denmark because of Greenland and everything else. So yeah, there's a few familiar things going on here. Canada is a very important market for the United States, of course, and the Canadians' retaliation is therefore particularly important. They're sort of an interesting country in lots of ways. They are the ones who invent the anti-dumping duty, for those of you who do trade policy. And they've been import substituting for a long time, and they've been discriminating against the rest of the world and in favor of Britain for a long time. And then Smoot-Hawley comes along. The Liberal Party is in power. There's going to be a general election, and they realize they have to position themselves against people who are going to say, we must retaliate against America. Okay, so they get their retaliation in first. So the Liberal government of Mackenzie King retaliates, lowers lots of duties on British goods, and also increases tariffs on American export goods that are particularly important to the Americans. It's not enough. It turns out. So again, this resonates. You know, there's a general election. The trade relationship with the United States is the big issue, and the party that says we are going to stand up for Canadian interests and retaliate against America if they do this to us, they win very handily. Back then, it was the Conservatives who were that party rather than the Liberals, and they come to power and they raise tariffs in general well, and they raise them differentially. So they do have a slight increase on tariffs on goods coming in from the British Empire, but tariffs on American goods go up by a lot more. Okay, so there's a big increase in the margin of discrimination. Okay. So one of the things that I've done with colleagues recently is I've tried to quantify the impact of this retaliation. Now, it turns out to be a little bit kind of complicated for a couple of reasons. One reason is those countries that protested, that's an objective list of 30 countries. If you protested, we know you protested, you know. But if you increase tariffs on goods coming from the United States, was that retaliation? Actually, you know, you could argue that you would have increased those tariffs on those goods anyway in the middle of the Great Depression, you know. So there's been a debate among scholars as to whether, say, the Canadian tariff increase was actually retaliation or was it just protectionism? You know, it can be difficult to tell. So anyway, what we did is we got quarterly data, so 3 monthly data on exports, so high frequency data. So we hoped that we would be able to use that high frequency data to use the timing of these interventions as, you know, that we would identify their impact that way. You know, most people usually use annual data when they do these kinds of exercises. So that was a kind of that was something that we had going for us. If you look at the countries that we think respond to the American tariff, there's no differences in their exports to the United States relative to countries that don't respond. You know, so basically everybody's exports to the United States are falling because of the Great Depression, you know, and because of Smoot-Hawley, which, by the way, was a non-discriminatory tariff increase. You know, so everybody is selling less to the Americans. Okay, but when you look at American exports to these two groups of countries, then you see a big difference, right? You see that the responders are, you know, the American exports to responders is falling by a lot. So on the face of it, there's something going on here, and then you can do your standard gravity exercises that lots of people in this room have done, and you look for the impact of either retaliating. So we coded some countries, like we coded the French as retaliators, you know. So there's been this debate, did they actually retaliate? But, you know, let's see what the data say, you know. And the data say that there's actually a really big impact, negative impact of retaliation on American exports to those markets. Although, interestingly, the countries that protested and threatened but we didn't code as retaliating, there's also a pretty big negative impact there. So there could be other things going on. There could be consumer boycotts going on. Maybe there's some hidden protectionism that we haven't been able to, that people haven't picked up on. And the point is, these are big effects. So this is saying that, you know, exports to retaliators fell by, say, 30%, even on top of the extent to which they would have already fallen because of the Great Depression. You know, that's the point. So these are big, big effects. So the Americans were really hurt by this, actually. And the effect is roughly twice as large for sovereign countries because we've got a mixture of colonies and sovereign countries in our sample. Okay, so that's suggesting that discrimination against America in the wake of Smoot-Hawley didn't help American export interests at all. There's a different way of doing this, which is to say, you know, real world trade policy, it's not a blanket intervention that hits all your exports, which is what those kinds of exercises in some sense are implicitly, they're not assuming, but it's as if it, you know, that's sort of what, it's the metaphor that's maybe motivating the regressions. But a real world trade policy involves tariffs and quotas on individual goods. You know, they go up more or less, you know, and so, you know, another approach is to go bottom up, you know, to measure the tariff increases on all of the goods that you can measure and look for the quotas, and then you can look for the impact of those things on trade flows for those goods, and then you can aggregate up and you can get a total effect. So that's an alternative way of doing the same thing. So we spent a lot of time over the past few years doing that for a bunch of countries. So you would be saying so you're interested in what the impact is say, of tariff increases on exports from America to your market, okay? And to see what the impact of that tariff increase is on American exports to your market, you need to compare the exports that actually took place with counterfactual exports that would have taken place if you hadn't increased those tariffs. Yes. So, you know, you need to do some counterfactual analysis. And for that, you need, you know, a model. So, I mean, you know, a very simple model, you know, is let's assume there's a thing called a demand curve and let's assume it slopes down, you know, and these are the actual imports from America in 1935, given 1935 tariffs, you know, and then we could ask, well, what if tariffs in 1935 had been not at their high 1935 level, but at their lower 1929 pre-depression level? The price would have gone down, the quantity would have gone up. You know, we know what this is, we know what this is, we know what these tariffs are. So now we just need the slope of this thing, and we would be able to say what the impact of that tariff increase was. So that's a very simple model. Okay, so you know, now the data is a bit more complicated than that. Okay, so there's a slide that we didn't go through. What we have is we've got data on lots and lots of imports of very detailed goods, you know, shelled walnuts, you know, this type of thing from different countries. And we know what the tariffs are on all of these goods from different countries, okay? So it's not one good, it's lots of goods. And, you know, each good is being imported from several trade partners. And we're particularly interested in that because the point is this discriminatory tariff environment involved tariffs going up more on some countries' products than on other countries' products, you know, and the Americans are finding themselves at a disadvantage. So we're interested in that, right? And so you need a more complicated model where you have maybe, you know, the American consumer who's importing different goods, and each good is being imported from different markets, you know, and the key elasticity that will determine to what extent you substitute away from American goods if American goods face discrimination is the elasticity of substitution between, say, American cars and Italian cars, something like that. And so, you know, so this is, you know, this demand framework is the equivalent of the demand curve, and these elasticities are the equivalent of the slope of the demand curve. And, you know, so we can estimate all of those things. And so that's sort of what the data looked like if you're very lucky, you know. So this is, it is walnuts. Yeah, this is Canadian data. So we have walnuts, Noix de Grenoble, wherever, and from different countries, and we know how much you're importing of these things, and you also know what the tariffs are that are levied. And this is very nice. The Canadians very handily give you the tariff data in the same table as the import data. So we only have one source to go to, you know. So we know the tariffs on everybody. We know how they change over time differentially across countries, and we can, you know, we can estimate all of these things. Okay, and I won't bother with the methodology because it's pretty standard. But we can estimate those slopes of those demand curves, those sigmas, And once you've done that, then you can do your counterfactual analysis, you know? So you can do, for example, what is the impact of tariff changes after 1930 on total UK imports from the USA? So we have a paper on Britain's turn to protectionism, and these results aren't in that paper, but I mean, I did them for this thing. So what you can see is that by 1932, British tariff increases which are discriminatory, are lowering US exports that mark by nearly 20%, which is pretty big, I think, you know. And then you can see it stabilizes at a much more moderate level, but even still, you know, it's 5–10%. And that's their number one market. We're doing work currently in Argentina, and you can see that there the numbers are really big. You know, they go down after 1933. You know, American exports to Argentina are being hit by discriminatory Argentinian policy to the tune of, you know, over 20%. You know, so big number. What's interesting there, if you're interested in these things, is that it's not so much tariffs, actually, it's exchange controls. And I don't have time to go into that, but they had very complicated exchange controls that discriminated for and against various trading partners and for and against various goods. And basically, they were systematically screwing the Americans and favoring the British, you know, and which is interesting historiographically, because there's something called the Rocca-Runciman trade treaty that everybody talks about here, which has got lots of tariff changes that were helping the British and hurting the Americans. But actually, the exchange control elements of that seem to be more important than the tariffs. So this is a period where there's a lot of disguised protectionism of various sorts. Here's the same exercise for the Netherlands. This is still a bit preliminary, but it looks like, you know, by the end of the period, we're getting very big numbers. You know, 20% or something. That's still a bit provisional. And here's the same exercise for Canada. Canadian tariff increases after 1930 were lowering US exports to Canada by about 6%. And they were raising UK exports by about the same amount. So it really is a story of discrimination. You know, it really is a story of discriminatory tariffs shifting trade flows between trade partners, well, in a way that we probably will see now. And you can even see the Americans worrying about it today, aren't they? They're worried about trade flows being shifted to Southeast Asia or whatever. You know, so that is what happens if you have discriminatory tariffs. Is trade flows will shift in response, and they shift a lot because those elasticities are high. Those sigmas that I was talking about are very high. So relative price changes have big effects on trade flows, and so this was not good for America. The final picture along this line that I'll show you, just looking not at the impact of tariff increases in Canada after the Depression, but looking at the total structure of their protection and its impact. So it's comparing the actual tariff structure in any given year with a free trade alternative where there's just zero tariffs. So just looking at the total impact. And what you can see is that systematically Canadian protection was lowering American exports to Canada by 15–20%. You know, because they had discriminated against America for a long time. And that was hurting American exports to Canada a lot, actually. So I would argue that there were very solid economic reasons why Americans would not have liked discrimination in trade policy, okay? And that's for surely true. Now, the last point to make on that note is that these discriminations turned out to be very long-lasting, much to American disgust. So in that Atlantic Charter clause, which I showed you earlier, I didn't highlight this little weasel phrase here, which the British insisted in putting in. So they said, we will allow everybody, you know, equal access to trade and so on, with due respect for their existing obligations. And that was the British insisting on having their existing discrimination in favor of the empire grandfathered into this clause. And if you look at the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the European empires, not just the British, but the French and so on, they all got their existing imperial discriminations grandfathered into the clause as well. So this continued, this move towards imperial preference that really blossomed in the 1930s, continued well into the post-war era. And if you remember the story of Britain's negotiation with the EEC in the 60s, the big issue that had to be surmounted was the issue of New Zealand lamb exports, that kind of thing. And when they had their referendum, their second referendum, and was it 74? I was in Brussels as a kid at the time. I remember grown-ups were all very worried about this. But basically, there needed to be some token concession made to the Brits to get them to vote the right way. And the token concession, again, had to do with New Zealand lamb. All right. So this imperial turn absolutely defined British economic policy until their entry to the European Economic Community in 73. So these things can be very long lasting, which is something that people might want to think about. All right. Finally, yeah, I'm okay. There were not just hard-nosed economic reasons why the Americans disliked discrimination. They also had geopolitical interests at play. In particular, they didn't want to be involved in any more world wars originating in Europe. So I've already mentioned that this conditional MFN clause, well, it got people upset all the time, because in the 19th century, because the Americans ended up being nice to some countries, not nice to other countries. There's no country in the history of world trade, Jacob Weiner says somewhere, that has ever accepted that there's a good reason why you should treat me less well than somebody else. And so this just ticks people off. And then things got worse in the 1930s. So in the 1930s, this has been a particular focus of our work. What you see is this general tendency towards imperial trade blocs that I mentioned earlier. So you have, the British in 1929, 30% of their imports are coming from the empire. It goes up to 42%. In France, 12% of their imports are coming from the empire in 1929. It goes up to 26%, So there's a big shift towards imperial trade blocs. So the whole world economy is becoming balkanized, which hasn't happened yet, by the way, this time around. I mean, maybe the Americans are going to shut themselves off from markets, but we haven't seen this kind of generalized fragmentation that we saw back then. And it was very dangerous back then, or at least people thought it was very dangerous back then, because let's imagine that this is what the quotes there are speaking to. Let's imagine that you're a country, an rapidly industrializing country that has a big demand for raw materials, which you buy from one country, and you pay for them by selling manufactured goods to another country. And imagine that these two countries are in different trade blocs, and that there are all of these discriminations and exchange controls and all sorts of things, Well, you might start feeling a little bit worried about this, because will I really be able to, count on, the exchange coming in from country A to buy the raw materials from country B? And what Hilgert is saying is that, you might, he has various euphemisms for this. You might therefore include foreign areas under your domination, just to make sure that you get those raw materials. Because supply chain concerns were something that were of huge concern in the 1930s also, and we know where that, what that led to. And so the United States comes along, and I mean, they are the good guys at this stage. And I mean, Cordell Hull is the person that people typically talk about at this point in this kind of talk. So he's a Southern Democrat, which means that he's a free trader, because Southern Democrats were always free traders. The slave-owning, land-owning classes, they exported agricultural goods, so they were always free traders. It was the Northern Republicans who were protectionists traditionally. And so what he says is, I basically was a standard Southern free trader when I was young, but then I see all these wars breaking out, and I enlarge my views from the national to the international theatre. And he basically becomes convinced that all of these tensions and rivalries having to do with discriminatory trade policy, with protectionism in general, with imperial trade blocs, that these are important sources of the tensions leading to war. So this is a very oft quoted, I think you quoted this, didn't you, in your paper with Philippe and Matthias, I think you might have done, at the start of it. So this is from his memoirs, so yeah, from 1916, unhampered trade dovetail with peace, high tariffs, trade barriers, and unfair competition with war. And so he always talks about trade barriers, but he always also talks about discriminations in all of his language. He thinks that these discriminations are particularly dangerous, and so he practices what he preaches. So basically, what's going to happen is, FDR comes to power, the Americans start to recover from the Depression because they leave the gold standard. And in 1934, Congress delegates to the president the power to do trade deals with other countries. As we know, it's Congress who has the power to do trade policy in America. They just give it to the president, they delegate it, to do trade deals. Not clear that that's what's going on right now. But anyway, that's another issue, you know? And so he goes out and he starts to negotiate trade deals. He does one with Canada, for example. I think that's the first one. And they finally get MFN status in Canada because they'd never had MFN status in Canada before. And they do various tariff cuts on Canadian imports. But what they do is it's a trade deal with Canada, but then the Americans unilaterally extend all those tariff cuts on Canadian imports. They extend them to the rest of the world. Okay, so they are now, you know, the country promoting anti-discrimination in trade, and that then leads to the Atlantic Charter and the GATT and the world that we have just left behind. Now, one last point, it's just a little tangent, and it's beyond the scope of, you know, what I can talk about. But, you know, was Cordell Hull right? You know, is there a link between trade and war? It's something that lots of people have including in this room, have thought about. I think there's good reasons to think so. So this is a quote from an Oxford colleague, Avner Offer, who's talking about the Anglo-German naval arms race that you can see there of the 1890s and the 1900s, and that had basically it was all to do with the demand for food and raw materials that an industrial country needs, you know, and they're coming from overseas, and you want security. You want security of the laneways. If there's a possibility of war, you want to be able to ensure that that you're resilient. And so, you know, the Brits had always had the #1 navy in the world, so they'd always been resilient. The Germans decide they want to be resilient too, and you can't both be resilient, and so this leads to a bit of problem. It doesn't explain World War I, obviously, but it actually does help explain why the Brits came in on the French side, because there was a doubt until the very end as to whether they would do that, and these considerations were important there. Now, the real point is that, you know, it turned out the Germans were not resilient. You know, that the Royal Navy did blockade them, and that there was widespread hunger in the Central Powers during World War I. That was a very important factor in ensuring the defeat eventually of the Central Powers, and that's a lesson that everybody remembers in the 1930s. So can I recommend this really, really good book by a Chicago historian called Tara Zahra. It's very easy to read. She has short chapters, you know, like Tolstoy or somebody. So you can gallop through it, you know. And she basically talks about the effect that this kind of blockade had on mentalities in continental Europe in the 1920s and 30s. And so they're all focused on food security, you know, which goes to the level of high politics. It goes to the level of, you know, garden allotments, you know, giving workers allotments so they can grow vegetables, architectural implicate, all sorts of things. It's a fascinating book. Anyway, this is a quote from Hitler, which but Hitler makes the point very well. He says, we're interested in food security, you know, but our foreign trade, if it's carried over the sea routes dominated by Britain, well, then we have a problem, you know. And so really we want to be importing our food and raw materials from nearby land territory that cannot be blockaded by the Brits. And then he goes on and he talks about, you know, there are two ways to get your food and your raw materials. There's the namby-pamby liberal bourgeois, I buy stuff and I sell stuff. There's that. And of course, there's the other more muscular alternative, which is the one that he favors, you know. And if you've read Adam Tooze's book on the Nazi war economy, I mean, he tells a story very compellingly. These kind of supply chain concerns are absolutely foremost in the Nazi mentality when they invade East, even when they invade Russia, you know, which seems suicidal, but in retrospect, but it was all about raw materials. And, you know, the causation is even more obvious in the Pacific theater, you know, where, you know, the Japanese are entirely focused on getting access to supplies of, you know, coal and iron ore and rubber and oil and all this stuff. All right. So to conclude, the Americans built a world that we all grew up in. They had every reason to do this. It wasn't just that they were good guys, you know, there was a lot of self-interest involved here. Economic self-interest, but also geopolitical self-interest. And that's what has been almost casually chucked into the dustbin by Donald Trump a couple of months ago. And that's, I think, the most dangerous feature of what has just happened at a time when the world's becoming more dangerous anyway. All right, I'll leave it there.
So we have time for a few Q&A. If somebody has a question, yes?
So thank you for this very, very engaging presentation. I had a question. So all the past changes, big changes in tariffs seem to be motivated, seem to have a rationale, motivated by some national interest in a sense. So okay, they could be good or bad, but there was a rationale. This one seems to be without any clear strategic rationale in terms of geopolitics or other things, perhaps. And wonder whether you could comment on it, on the historical, say, perspective.
Well, there's been a huge literature on why countries protect, you know, and, in America, it's gone through various phases. For a long, long time, they protected for revenue reasons, you know, because the federal government didn't have an income tax. And so this was the major source of revenue for the federal government. And then they move into a phase of protecting to build up industries, import substituting industries and so on. Whenever the Republicans are in power, you have higher tariffs and so on. And that's like in continental Europe and many places, you know, so you can easily explain it in terms of maybe not the national interest, which I tend not to think matters as much, but in terms of sectional interests, you know, and the balance of power and so on. I mean, if you listen to Trump, what he's saying is they're going back to the old revenue motivation, you know, that's what he says. Now, whether people believe that or not, we were having this debate over dinner last night. I mean, for sure, he has a budgetary problem. So in his head, this might be a solution. Yeah.
So I have two questions. The first one is on the various figures you showed us, where you reported that various countries were impacted differently.
Yes.
Can we nail the heterogeneity to some key parameter, or that could be relevant even for today to know which countries are more likely to suffer if they are taxed compared to others? And I have a second question with just the recent announcement that Trump made to tax Brazilian goods up to 50%. So it's here, the motivation seemed to be highly political, revenue based, I don't know, but is there any event or precedent cases that really show that you can make a government change its behavior with tariffs? I wanted to know whether you have some precedent.
Those are two difficult questions. I mean, you know more about sanctions than I do, don't you? Surely. Off the top of my head, I think that tariffs tend to just make people irritated, and they tend to retaliate. I think that's the most common response. I think, you know, probably, unless there's such an asymmetry of power that you don't have that option. But I mean, what does he want? Does he want Lula to resign or something? Or does he want, I mean, you know, it's hard to know what he wants really, you know. In terms of the heterogeneity, well, I mean, so in those pictures I was showing you, they were kind of based on country by country studies. And so by definition, it's difficult for me to talk about heterogeneity because so maybe at the end there will be a master study that brings them all together, and we can look for any systematic differences. But I mean, those differences, they were largely policy driven as well. Like different countries are choosing to retaliate differently, you know, for different idiosyncratic reasons. The more I do this, the more I think that there's an advantage to looking at individual countries rather than just looking at average effects across countries for all sorts of reasons, yeah, because things are so specific. Yeah.
One actor that perhaps, I mean, I would like to think about is really corporations. And we have the lobby for sale framework that is thinking of corporations trying to influence national politics. But perhaps the new element here is that we have these huge economic actors that don't have really a political representation in deciding on these issues that affect them. So I was wondering whether, you know, going again back in history, if you think of how in the past these corporations have affected these decisions, basically the big shipping companies of the 19th century or the company of the Indies, if we could draw some lessons on what might happen today with
certainly from the late 19th century, my sense is that big business is organizing in various industrial federations and things, and they have their they have their word to say, you know. But then, so for example, if you think about late 19th century Germany, you know, the heavy industry in the Ruhr, you know, they're very protectionist, and they kind of they organize, and they make alliances with the agrarians. In America, there are various chambers of commerce in the 1930s who were actually very active in lobbying on various sides. And I had a student in Oxford who looked at all that. So the problem is, it's easy to show that they are lobbying and that they're taking positions. It's less easy to show that their lobbying is having an effect on policy, you know? I mean, you couldn't even do it as an economist. You'd have to really do it as a historian, I think, and look at the art. But even there, it's going to be difficult because the policymakers are responding to so many things at the time. So certainly in the 1930s, I think big business is very well organized. And I think if there are any historians here, I'd say there's a big research agenda there people go for. Now, are they less well organized now, and do they have less impact now? I don't know. That's another interesting question, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. Really enlightening presentation. So I was wondering about one thing is that in the interwar period, it seems like this type of policy failed, this type of like threats, because the US was maybe less of a military hegemon because the Brits and the French had their own empire, and so the response was like more damaging. So do you interpret the current Trump attitude as he knows he's the military hegemon for sure, and it's sort of he knows the risk, but those are less dangerous for the US because of the military power he has, for instance, over NATO in the end. So I was wondering about also how can we measure the degree of military hegemony and how it interacts with this type of thing. It's just an open question. I was wondering about that.
It's a great, I mean, it's hard to look at the European response and not think that if it weren't for the war in Ukraine, we would have been more muscular. That's for sure. And of course, then there are lessons for Europe as to what we do in the future to make sure we're not in this same position. I don't know. I mean, you could argue, if you think about, you know, hegemonic stability there and all that, you could argue that the way he's behaving, it's almost a sign of American weakness or of a declining hegemony. Because if you're a very confident hegemon, you kind of, then you think, well, the world's interests are my interests. If you're a big enough chunk of the world, then what's good for the world is good for me. And clearly he doesn't think that at all, you know? So I wonder whether it doesn't show a decline in American ambitions to, you know, well, he's isolationist also, isn't he? And so, yeah, I would see it as more, they're coming off the peak. And that's when things get dangerous.
Last question.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the presentation. Very interesting. I was wondering, because we know that today what the consequences of the trade policies that we are observing is also trade, circumvention of the tariffs that are imposed. Have you evidence of such circumvention strategy in the data you observed in the 30s?
No, we observe trade flows from different countries, so we can't tell whether certainly what we've done so far, we can't tell whether individual goods have been transshipped, that type of thing. Once we have a full database with all of our countries simultaneously, we can maybe look for those kinds of responses. But a lot of the things that we see, you know, go well back in the past. I mean, like, for example, tariff hopping firms, you know, that goes back to the 19th century and so on. So where, you know, people do respond to relative price changes very predictably, I would say. So I wouldn't be surprised if there wasn't some. In which case, that's some of what we're picking up in our results, I suppose. Yeah. I'm trying to think of how I would look for historical evidence of it. Be difficult. Not in the aggregate statistics, you won't get it, I guess. You need to go to more micro qualitative sources. But it seems like an interesting thing for somebody to do, actually.